You're listening to the Pulled by the Root podcast.
Hello, everyone. This is your host, Heidi Marble. I am so excited to welcome Darryl Nelson to our podcast today. I am going to read you Darryl's bio so we can learn a little bit more about him before we have a big conversation. Darryl Nelson is an adopted person born in the 1960s. He undertook research in order to understand how, in a so-called civilized society, to forcibly remove a baby from its mother and supply to another family was deemed acceptable. Darryl was curious about how Australian law against a single mother and a baby were so exacting. In his book, A Timeline of the Injustice of Adoption Law, Darryl explores the timeline of adoption throughout history. He feels for the families that have been torn apart and lost forever. So, Darryl, before we dive in, I received your book.
Thank you.
And I feel like I am going through some kind of an emotional earthquake when I'm reading it. And if we have time, we can touch on a few things. I think the fact that you did this book, it really enriches the understanding of how history really needs to be understood so we can confront the problems that we're facing today. But before we do all of that, your story is so compelling. And one of the things when we had our introductory call, being from the United States, I'm like, you got discharged from your adoption. What?
Yeah, there's a lot of people that want to do this, and I think they call it divorce or annulment or something of your adoption. So yeah, it's. I think American law has to catch up there.
For sure. So, Darryl, if you would just take us, historically in your life, take us back to the beginning and what you know to be true about your story.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on, by the way, I should say that. As an adoptee, you tell this story so many times. You know, there's the short version, the long version, there's the emotional version and the non. I'll try and try and not be emotional today if I can do that. I mean, I didn't really find out I was adopted until I was around 14. And then after that, I didn't really want to know where I came from. I was watching, we were in the country, in the back of, like hours and hours from a town, really isolated. And I was there with my parents on a property we were renting, and I had watched on TV a matinee movie where, little Johnny was adopted. And I went in after the movie, I went in and saw Mum and said, hey, I'm not adopted, am I? It wasn't the first time I asked. And this time she started crying and she basically ran away to another room. And I thought, okay, that wasn't the answer that I was expecting. And then Dad followed her, and I could hear they having an argument, and they usually didn't really argue between themselves. Dad used to argue with me all the time, but he didn't really argue with Mum. So then I realised there was something really wrong. And it seemed like hours, because that was midday, right? And then it wasn't until it was night that they sort of came back in, and she handed me a piece of paper which was to do with my adoption. I think it was the adoption order or something like that. And then she said, yeah, that's and your real name was Shane Allen Wallace. And I thought, whoa. And I was literally in the middle of nowhere. And I was doing well in school. And I thought, what am I going to do here? These people have lied to me all my life, So I thought, how do I get out of here? Do I go back to Sydney? Do I catch a train? How do I get there? I was really thinking, flight. And then, I went to my room and I sat there. I was left alone with this information. There was really nothing much beyond that. And I remember it took me all night to think through what I should do. And the next morning, it was Monday, and I got up and I went to school, and I thought, well, those people didn't want me, I don't want them. So as my way of coping was to hate my, birth parents, whoever they might be. And then, fast forward to, when I was about 30 years old, after my dad died when I was 22, I sort of got the idea that maybe I should grow up a little and not think about, laying blame. And I just really wanted to know where I came from. And I think I first started thinking about it as far as for medical records. But, of course, nothing was available. The laws didn't let you find where you came from, didn't let you search. Then when I was around 27 or 28, the laws changed. And you could do a search to find out, who your birth mother was, I think, or your adoption order or your birth certificate maybe. Because in Australia, like I guess it is in the States, the government gives you a false birth certificate. They give you a birth certificate as if you are as if you are born to your adoptive parents. So I wrote away for that and I got given that after many years of trying to, find out where I came from. So then I thought, all right, I have this birth certificate. I'll write away for more information. So, basically I was drip-fed information all my life over my story. So it took me, I'm now 56. It took me up until about 54 to get all the information I could get. So what happened was my mother was my birth mother. I'll use my mother because people say birth mother and things like that. So, not offending anyone, but I'll say natural mother or mother. So my natural mother, her name is Beverly, and she, from what I can tell, she had me when she was 21 years old. She had a long-term boyfriend called Alan, and, since 16, they've been seeing each other off and on. Alan went away to do his apprenticeship, and they were in Brisbane, in Australia, in Queensland. Alan went to Mackay, which is a few hours north of Brisbane. So they really, in those days, there wasn't much. There wasn't really, don't pick up the phone because it cost too much money. It was like letter writing and stuff like that. But he was away for about a year and a half. But they used to visit. Anyway, one of these visits, obviously, I was conceived, and then she went back, and there was a lot of pressure on her to have me. I was given away. What happened was it turned out that my mother went back to Brisbane, and her first cousin, was staying there with the family. He was a shearer, and he was staying with the family. And they went to the drive-in movies as cousins. She came back from the drive-in movie and she was in tears. No one knew why, but she wouldn't talk about it. And then they found out later she was pregnant, and her mother put two and two together and, worked out that she probably was raped by this cousin. So then there was pressure on to, not bring the baby home, and she was living in a family where there was no father. He had died. So there was, I think, a family of 4 girls and a mother, and they didn't want another, baby to feed. So she had me at 21 years old, and she signed the consent to my adoption 2 days after I was born. And she didn't tell Alan. Now, I would have been willing to accept the rape story, except she named me Shane Allen Wallace. Allen spelled Allen, which is the same way that Alan spelled his name. And that came from, historically, was a surname in their family tree. So that's how that name was given down. When I wrote away for my information and I got my birth certificate, I then wrote away for what I could find, like a marriage certificate perhaps, and I got that. And I wasn't supposed to get that. They made a mistake and they sent it to me. So I got the marriage certificate, and here's this marriage, Beverly has married Alan. So it turned out, and I thought, well, gee, that's the same name, spelt the same way. Maybe he's my father. So it turned out that I was given away. Unfortunately, she told the social worker that the rape story, I imagine, and she named the father as her cousin, Gary, but she named me after Alan. So in Australia, there's this thing called deferred adoption. And deferred means you're not suitable for adoption. You don't qualify. You're not good enough for adoption. And so that means that if you're not good enough, you basically go into an institution or a foster care. And if you're institutionalised, which is the worst of the worst, that means you basically have no mother and father. You've grown up in some sort of religious order. And there was reviews on these religious orders in Australia and in Queensland around the time that I was born and beyond. There was a review of what happened in those institutions, and a lot of those kids were raped or prostituted out. It was a really terrible situation. So luckily I avoided that, but I was fostered. So my mother signed a consent to adoption, and she wasn't told I was fostered. So legally she could have got me back at any time. Legally she should have visited me, but they didn't tell her any of this. So I was fostered to my adoptive parents, for 2 years. People lie, and it has effect on other people. And in those days, the truth was all hidden. Nothing was shared, and people had versions of what the truth was. And these things directly affected my life. What the government did directly affected my life. So for the 2 years I was in foster care, basically it's called a deferred adoption. In other words, I couldn't be adopted, but I could be fostered. During those 2 years, Alan came back from Mackay, back to Brisbane, and they met up again, continued the relationship, and they got married. 2 days after they got married, she had another baby, and his name was Lawrence. And she's had a first son, given that one away, had a second son, and he's died. Then she tells Alan, by the way, I gave away your first son. And up until that point, he didn't know. So, and she said he was adopted out. She didn't say, he's fostered, we can get him back, because she didn't know, right? The government of the day, and, you could argue the same governments today, they put a priority on adopting. So although the laws said the best interests of the child was the paramount concern, in other words, there was a duty of care to the child, the government didn't care about that. The government cared about getting the child into a family straight away. So I was on a path. No matter what happened to me, I was on a certain path. But the irony was that my mother had started this path unconsciously by not naming the right father. Whether she was protecting Alan or, he's doing his apprenticeship, maybe she doesn't want him to lose his chance at learning a trade, or I don't know what. Maybe she was just scared of a mother, more likely. She, had to continue that lie because she let her mother believe that this guy, Gary, the shearer, was the father, because it allowed her to come back into the fold, into the family. So, unfortunately, that set off a set of circumstances that led me to be adopted. So, I grew up a happy child. I was pretty happy in the family. I did look different. I had very white skin, and they had olive skin, had brown eyes, and I have hazel eyes. So I thought, it's a bit weird, but anyway, I'll take that on. And then, there was friction. Dad wasn't a very happy man. He was very angry and sometimes violent. One time he hit me and broke my nose when I was about, I think, 8 or 9 years old. So, there was a healthy, and from my point of view, a healthy distance between me and my father, my adoptive father. Mum was loving, caring, never a problem. She always wanted me. But she tended to be the in between me and Dad to make sure everyone was happy. She was always, walking on pins and needles trying to make everyone happy. But I was a bit wary of Dad because he had a very short fuse. So, yeah, that's how I grew up. And unfortunately, around the same time that I had my nose broken, my birth mother died. And I didn't know this until later. So she died of a brain hemorrhage when she was 30 years old. She went on to have two other sons. With Alan, she had a boy named Conrad and another boy named Joel, his second name is Joel Allen. So I had two full brothers that I didn't know, full blood brothers, and I grew up an only child. So that was a bit of a stark contrast to, it felt like to me that I'd missed out on a childhood, with them. The adoption went through when I was, 2 years later. So in 1966, I was classified as Jean and Eddie's child. And that's what happened. We went further on from there. So when I was, fast forward to when I was 30, and I received this marriage certificate, and I put two and two together, that Alan was probably the father. I had a friend in Medicare, which is our government health thing, and she was a pretty close friend, and she broke a few rules and looked up who was who. And that's where I found out about Joel and Conrad and this another girl, my sister Catherine. And so I rang Alan because I found, first of all, we rang Beverly's mother's number. That's when we found out that Beverly had died. So her name was Dorothy. So we rang her, and my girlfriend at the time pretended to be someone looking for Beverly. And so we didn't, in those days, there was no format for meeting your birth family. There were stories about what had happened to other people, and usually bad things had happened, like they'd turn up at doors and they were slammed in their face. And now there's a more constructed way of doing things, but back then it really wasn't. So that's why the phone calls, and they were in Queensland, I was in New South Wales at the time, in Sydney. So it was easier on the phone anyway. But so I rang Alan after, not being able, realising my mother had died. I rang Alan and I said, I just wanted to talk to you about Beverly. And he said, oh, yeah. And I said, I told him, who I thought I was. And I said, are you my father? And he goes, yeah, I reckon I would be. There you go. So there wasn't any, there was no government involvement in the meetup or anything like that, or third-party support. There was nothing like that. Psychologically, in those days, there was no support for an adoptee. There was not even much knowledge about what happens to adoptees. There is now, but the difference is it's still ignored, I suppose, now. Whereas back in the day, it wasn't really known, and so it couldn't be ignored. It was conveniently not known. So anyway, met Alan, and as it turned out, my adoptive mum, Jean, Eddie's brother, whose name was William, had died in Brisbane. So I was going to a funeral up there, and I said, I talked to Alan and said, look, I'm coming up this weekend. Can I meet you? And he said, sure. So after the funeral, which, by the way, was the same cemetery my mother was buried in, but I didn't know it at the time, I went back to the hotel. I saw my mum Jean off on the train, and I went back to the hotel and I met Alan and his wife Sue. He'd remarried and had a wife called Sue, and my half-sister Catherine. And I sat on the bed and they sat opposite, and as I talked, they'd say, that's Conrad. As I moved my arms, they'd say, that's Joel. Because my mannerisms, how I sounded, what I said was exactly like my brothers who hadn't met yet. So it took a couple of years before I met them. Conrad was overseas in America, and he came back. He was living down south somewhere, and he had a slight southern accent that I used to tease him about. And then Joel was a chef, and I met him, and I love to cook. Joel plays the drums. I play the drums. Yeah, so, we were very similar in nature. But, the secrecy was they didn't even know about me. And they didn't, for that matter, know about Lawrence either. So, when I showed up, suddenly it's all out there, So not only am I talking, hi, I'm your brother, it's not only that, it's all the baggage of all the lies that you have to carry forward. So you're exposing everyone. And as an adoptee, you don't want to have to do that.
No.
It's bad enough just launching yourself into a family and saying, by the way, hey, I missed out on a whole childhood with you, let alone being the carrier of all this stuff. And I met my grandmother on my mother's side, and she was very stoic, very forced woman, very strong woman, and I could see then how my mother would have felt in that relationship. And still, she didn't tell me the truth. So no, from that point, she thought that I was still this guy Gary's child. It wasn't until maybe 5 or 6, 7 years later, because I started to visit Alan and the family more often over time, and then one phone call from my aunt on my mother's side, we'd met. Her name was Deirdre, and she called me one Christmas, and she'd had a couple of drinks pre-Christmas, and she said, "Oh, what are you doing this Christmas?" And I said, "Oh, I'm going up to visit Alan." And she said, "Oh, what are you going to see him for? He's not your father." And I said, "Well, he thinks he's my father." And she said, "Oh, no, your mother was raped by her cousin, and you're the progeny of a rape." And I said, "Oh, okay, thanks, have a happy Christmas." And I was gardening at the time, and I went back to doing the gardening, and I paused and I thought, hang on, by my own standards, I shouldn't exist, because if I was a woman and I was raped, I would have terminated. So that puts you in a really funny place, in a headspace, yeah? And I lived with that for a little while. I went to the doctor before I flew up to see Alan, and I said, is there any way I can prove, he's my father? And he said, oh, yeah, there's this thing called a DNA test. Of course, this is back in the day, right? This is back in, when AIDS first came up and things like that. So we're talking 80s, I think, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so he said, oh, you need a blood sample from your mother. And I said, I can't get one. And he said, oh, what about what about that side of the family? I said, no. I said, I can get a blood sample from my father. And he said, yeah, that's fine, get it from the father. So then I had to go up and see this guy in a couple of weeks and tell him somehow, even though he's accepted me and introduced me to the family, and has accepted me as his son, let's prove it. It was a very hard conversation to have. He's in Queensland on a property. It's a big veranda. It's sort of up one level because they build the houses up there so that the breeze can get through down the bottom because it's warm. So Christmas down here is warm, very hot, and he's fond of a rum. So we're sitting there on the balcony one night, the mozzies flying around, and we're having a little sip of rum together. And we don't really, because people around all the time, so we didn't really have much chance to speak. And we finally got a moment together. And here was my moment to say, oh, can we do this DNA test? I didn't know what to say. I thought, I believe it. I don't want to. And then he started talking about the family and how he felt deserted after Beverly had died by that side of the family, and how he had 2 young boys and alone. And he said, I don't know whether it stems from the story about you or what, but he said, isn't there some test we can take to prove that I'm your father? And I said, yeah, there's a thing called a DNA test. We could probably do one of those. And we did it. And so he did his, he took blood up in Queensland, and I took blood in Sydney, and then I went to see the doctor to get the results. And I walked into this clinic, and I really hadn't been into it was like a STD type clinic, and like
Great.
drug rehab. And I thought, well, I haven't been one of this before. And anyway, so the doctor called me in, and he said, look, you're a father. And I said, no, I'm not the father, I'm the son. And he goes, oh. And he looked at the notes and goes, yeah, you're the son. So, so it's been proven legally. And so then I had, this piece of paper that said I was his son for real. And then I proceeded to post that to all the people that have been telling me these stories. So we had on a journey that's taken now, we're probably in my 30s, I guess. This is a short podcast, so I won't give you the whole information, but over time, bit by bit, I found other pieces to the story, and so I reconciled myself with where I belonged in the family. It's been hard because I live down there. They still live up in Queensland, so it's been very hard trying to build a relationship. But I continued to try. And then, recently, I'm talking about 2 years ago, I decided to do a will. And it's not the first will I'd done, but I decided to do a will. And I went to a government lawyer over here because they have a trustee and guardian or something like that. But anyway, I decided to go do that. And I was leaving some things to my birth family. And I said I wanted to leave such and such to my brother Conrad, to my brother Joel, to my sister Catherine, to my father Alan. And the lawyer said, hang on, you can't say that. And I said, can't say what? And they said, she said, you can't call them brother and father because they're not. And I said, yes, but they are, because here's my DNA proof. And she said, yeah, but legally they're not. Legally you don't have a relationship with them. So after all that I'd been through, the law was still telling me who I was. I didn't like that. And then at the same time, around about the same time, the laws also changed that let me find more information. So I started to get more forms, like I got my mother's consent form, a copy of that. I got the notes from the doctor that said that I was that something could be wrong with me because I was, inbred, basically. Inbred product of a rape is what I think the notes were about. So I thought, well, hang on, that's not true. So I said to the government again, I said, look, I've got my DNA, that's not true. And they said, well, it doesn't matter because what your mother said at the time is what we consider as truth. So, by now I had the story. I knew the government's role in not, telling my mother and my father, because I think they needed his consent too, because by then they were married and I wasn't adopted yet. They should have got his consent, but they didn't do that either. And all that lie that had been compounded and then falsified in my records. So I thought, well, that's not who I am. So I thought I can do something about this. And I don't know how, the heavens aligned, but I found out about this thing called discharge. Basically, in Australia, the Act came in, I think it was 2009. And, there's a federal law, there's state laws. And in Queensland, there were certain grounds you could prove. If you prove those grounds, you could have a discharge. So I didn't undertake a discharge of adoption to hurt my mother, who's still alive, my adoptive mum. I did it because I want to be me, truthfully, legally me, I don't want the government stealing my lineage, my ancestry. I don't want to be buried in the ground with a tombstone that says my, adoptive name. So I thought, well, if it's available to me, then I'll try and do it. So the grounds are something like if you can prove that the adoption was conducted under false pretenses. For example, if there was duress on the mother, which is basically 99% of adoptions, there's duress, but that's hard to prove. especially without the mother being there. If something was done that was against the law. When you make a statement, you think that about the paternity and you say the wrong person, that affects my life going forward, that's not the truth. So you're actually lying to the government. But the government didn't seem to care about that. They didn't really care who the father was. The lawyer that I talked to on the government side at one point said it could have been an alien. It didn't really matter. She could have said it was a green man from Mars, because they don't really care about that. All they care about is getting that baby transported to the new home. One of the grounds was exceptional circumstances, and it was very broad and not defined in law, but it was one of the grounds where you could probably prove that you were mentally unwell. Then if you had evidence like that, you could ask for a judge from the Supreme Court. So this is the highest court in Queensland you have to go to, and you can ask for a discharge. Discharge means that what was happened at the time you were born, like your original birth certificate, that they put a stamp on and said not to be used for official purposes, now is actually used. That's your real birth certificate again, and the adoptive one is null and void. So basically you are creating a new legal relationship with your birth family, but unfortunately you're erasing the legal relationship with your adoptive family. The government makes you choose, you can't have both. So I thought it was more important to tell the truth than to live a fiction created by government. So I decided to go ahead and do it. So I got some quotes from some lawyers to do this. The first lawyer, just to prepare a document to go to court, he wanted $8,000 to write a document. Then I talked to a couple of other lawyers and barristers, and one of them wanted $100,000 and the lawyer wanted $40,000. So it was $140,000 to go to court. And I thought, well, I'm not stupid. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm not stupid. So I thought, well, I can write a letter and I can prepare my own stuff. And so I did. And I wrote a case, an affidavit about my life history. And then I went and saw a psychologist for, about 8 or 9 times and had her write up her opinion on me. Unfortunately, it sort of came in that, there was mental issues like depression and all the standard things that adoptees tend to have, like fear of relationships and post-traumatic stress disorder, because they've associated adoption with that as well, even though the baby doesn't know that, it's not remembered, but it's recalled by the baby that, the mother was there and then the mother's not there. So, the baby has to work out a way to cope. And some babies cope by being clingy. Some babies cope by rejecting their adopted parents. And that plays out all through their lives. So, PTSD and other areas. So, I had evidence to prove that I was mentally not well, yet I was well enough to conduct a court case and present that. And anyway, so I went before the judge and, luckily enough, he gave me the discharge. Yeah, I'm still coming to terms with it, actually. It's about 2 years fresh.
Yeah, Darryl, there's so much I want to ask you. What a mind-boggling journey that you have been on to find your truth. I can't even imagine putting all of these pieces back together. As you empower yourself with the discharge, can you explain a little bit more emotionally what that's been like? Because you're having to literally give up the ties. You're having to choose.
Yeah, that was very hard. I had moments through my life where I had fallen in a heap. And I think the hardest thing for me was the discharge. I fell in a heap when I thought I was the product of a rape. I fell in a heap when I realised that I'd never met my mother and she was in the ground somewhere and I never saw the ground. And so that was significant moments. But preparing a court case for the Supreme Court, I had to partition myself. I had to be a lawyer, I had to be a victim, and I had to put my emotions on the shelf. And sometimes that worked. I was driven by, I wouldn't say anger, a sense of injustice, perhaps, that all these things happened to me. And I was really driven by, I want what is right. And I put my emotion on the shelf through this. So I'm writing my affidavit, I'm talking about what happened to me in my life. And, this is during COVID. We are locked down. We can't go out unless we have a valid reason to leave the house. And I had to get signatures of justice of the peace to prove, on an affidavit. I had to send that affidavit, that personal information about me, to every person concerned with the adoption: my adoptive mother, my father, my brothers, my sister, the government. All those people had to legally be respondents to my application. So here I was sharing my most innermost, what happened in my life with people that I'm trying to build a relationship with. So they make you go through hell. And, I remember one time I had to get an affidavit signed. My first affidavit was something like 50 pages long, and that was the short version. And all legally, because what I tried to do was say, okay, this happened to me and this is for legal grounds. For example, the government placed me as a deferred adoption, but they didn't check out, they didn't research as to whether my mother was telling the truth. My mother said my father wouldn't look after me. Did they even make a phone call to see whether he would? No. So they had a duty of care that they didn't care, they didn't care about. So, I had to put that in an affidavit and put the legal points next to the, emotive points, if you like, and prove my case, as you would in law. And so then I had this, document that I had to try and get signed by a lawyer to then issue to the court. And I remember going there and because of COVID, you couldn't actually go inside. The lawyer had a desk outside the door and he stood in front of the desk and he handed the documents by the desk and he stamped them and signed them. I was checking them. I was making sure he signed every page. And as I did, I saw my hand start to shake and I thought, hang on, what's this about? And that's the emotion that was on the shelf finally came off the shelf without me knowing, and I basically fell into a mess. But I was driven to get this done and I needed to get it in a satchel. So I was in Brisbane. In COVID, all the mail stopped, right? So you couldn't even get the documents to Brisbane court. So then I, discovered new things about myself, about how I dealt with issues. I figure, I've never been married, I've never had kids, and I think now that after doing all this and understanding what happens to adoptees, I can really see, okay, this is an effect of my adoption. How I emotionally respond to things, I can kind of now delineate that's an adoptee's response, and this is me maybe, but I don't even know who me is because there was no pre-adoptive me. My mother, when she was pregnant, knew that she was going to give me away. So all through that separation trauma, I don't know who I really am. I know who I am now because I've got a piece of paper that says that, but, it's really confusing. And the more you read about it, because I read so many books now, Time and Wound, I got this one out because all these detached theories that I had and suddenly it came together and I thought, okay, got it. And then I read a lot more. I mean, I was reading book upon book upon book. I've still got a stack of books. So, your question was, how did I feel emotionally? I had to hold it together. I had to hold it together in a court. I had to stand there in front of a judge and present my case as a lawyer and had to talk to them about myself as a child, because that's how the law sees you as a child. They had it in a closed court. I can't actually tell you what happened in that court and what the judge's decision was, because it's not published by the law. And if I tell you, I go to jail for 2 years. Do you believe that? This is the state of the law. And that, that got me after the discharge, and after I went through that, I then started to think, because I read so much about the law, I thought, what is wrong with these people? Why is the law? Because everywhere I looked, there was a block. The law was so finite, and it trapped me, and there was no way out for my mother. And I thought, how can it be so perfect? Because laws are made by people. So how can it be so perfect? And then I started to think, all right, well, I'll research where these ideas came from. And then I ended up researching so much that I ended up putting that into a book. Yeah, you got
Darryl, and I love this, and I'm really happy we're going to do more than one episode. As an adopted person, as a person who's also 56, your book was such a huge hit of information that I think is really helpful, because as we're trying to sort out who am I, that's the question. People that aren't adopted are asking that question, but when you're an adopted person, holy hell, like it's so complicated. But to understand the bedrock, the groundwork, the foundation historically, I'm really excited to hear from you about how this translates to now and what you think the solutions are. And I know you and I discussed it as well, that Australia has made some progress, and that's exciting news, I guess, for lack of a better word, in hopes that our global communities can begin to start to see, listen, if we make enough noise and we push back enough, I think really the only way to change this is through the law.
I think that the governments don't care about anything until it starts hitting them in the pocket, right?
Right.
You can lobby government and they can be nice about it, and eventually the laws change. And by the time they change and any idea of compensation comes in their head, maybe they do that, maybe they set up some recompense. By then, most people are dead, right? In Australia, you've probably heard about it. We call it the stolen generation. That's where Aboriginal people were forcibly taken from their families, for their children were taken from their families and put into institutions and retrained not to be black, trained to speak English, trained to be servants to white people. There was an apology from government back in the late 1900s, I think it was, about the stolen generation. There's another group of people they labelled the forgotten Australians. And these are the people that are in institutions. Like I said before, if you didn't get fostered, if you didn't get adopted, you ended up in an institution. And they were abused sexually, physically, mentally. They were denied basic nutrition. So they've had an apology. Our Prime Minister Gillard apologised to what she called forced adoptions, people like us, where they acknowledged the damage that was done to mothers and their children and fathers and such. But they don't ever really announce any redress. They apologise and maybe they give you some psychological support. If you're lucky, you might get a couple of sessions for free. Beyond that, they don't do much more. Maybe over time, they do this. I mention these things because they've happened in America. They've happened in Canada. There's only been recently in the news where they've dug up bodies of children in Canada, in Native American children as well. In Ireland, just recently, the corpses of children with unmarked graves were discovered inside these institutions run by certain religious orders that I won't bother to name. So, this is what I dug up in that book that I wrote, and I was just repulsed by how humans treat other humans, and especially in the name of religion and government. They're a party to this. They dictated these things. The religious orders were just accessories. So, you get a bit like an activist, unfortunately, when you uncover this stuff. Plenty of adoptees, want to live in denial. That's fine. I'm not here advocating for justice if you don't want it. But when you discover the truth, and you just can't turn your back on that. It's like picking up a rock and all these creepy crawlies, you just turn your back on it. I can't do that. So I don't know what the future holds, but I know that some of the laws in Australia might, be a start for other countries. Like if America apologised for forced sterilisation, hello, eugenics.
Yeah. Darryl, there is so much to unpack. Mm-hmm. Can you just give people like not a movie trailer, but some kind of a summary basically about what you're going to be walking them through? Just maybe skim over it so that we can have a feeling of what people are going to look forward to in the next episode.
All right. Well, I think I'll take you on my journey, if you like, because what I did was like I said, going through the discharge, you end up reading about adoption law, about laws under care, I think was the term they used when you're in foster care, under care. But there was not much care involved in that from the government side. And other laws around that gave them the power. They created their own laws to give them the power to do what they did to me and to many others. I started to think about, like you said at the start, how one human could think it was right to take a baby off a mother and give it to someone else. And there was a key word there. It said feeble-minded. In one of the texts that I read, there was something around feeble-minded. And I thought, what is this thing feeble-minded? And then from that little word, I thought, okay, that traced me back to what eugenics was in America, because laws weren't written in Australia. We inherited them from other countries. It was colonialism in a way, and Australia was a litmus test for some of the laws from the UK, but America, had eugenics. They sort of kind of invented the idea or went with eugenics as the notion, which is, I don't know whether you know, but it's for those that don't, in the early 1900s when Darwin had his theory about evolution, survival of the fittest and those notions, his cousin took it upon himself to go, all right, well, what Darwin had said took eons to happen in animals. This guy thought it could be done in 3 generations. So you could weed out bad humans from their, genes, because there was no DNA then. There was just the idea of genes. So he said, well, there's obviously the elite ruling class, which are all white. So they should have more power, and it's only right that we have more power. And then you have other classes of people, like, people of colour or of low socioeconomic ability, or so they started classifying people. And one of the classifications was feeble-mindedness. And if you're feeble-minded or classed as, and you're a woman, it meant that they could take your baby away. So they took babies and gave them to other families because they thought, well, that we can re-educate that baby and that baby can turn into, as long as they're white, mind you, they didn't do this with black people or anything like that. So, yeah, as long as you're white in America and, maybe they could turn you into something good. And as for the mothers, they often sterilise those mothers. But of course, eugenics and those notions and those laws that were upheld at the Supreme Court in America turned into Nazism and turned into the Holocaust, right? So some of those laws, I think they were directly taken from American law and put into German law when Hitler was running things. So, yeah, that's a whole big topic. And before that, if you go back even further, where the laws came from, you're back in England now and you're talking about, okay, the poor laws, they were called. There were the new poor laws and the old poor laws. Basically, it meant that if you were poor and living on, a rich person's estate and working for that person, if you're a mother, you got pregnant and, you basically couldn't work. So they thought, well, we don't want mothers not working. As soon as that baby is had, we'll take that baby and we'll institutionalise them and we'll raise that baby so the rich aristocratic male, wealthy landowner gets more workers that way. So this is kind of how it started in England. And some of those laws, again, were written and now adoption law takes from all those things and historically is a piece-by-piece amendment over time to turn into what we have today. Even the notion of, in America, in some states, you can't get information on where you came from still, right? Do you know where that law came from? There was a New York governor who had adopted a child illegally from a woman who I can't remember her name straight away, and she gave a lot of babies to movie stars and such, and he had adopted this child. She was doing this all illegally. She was, this is another big topic, all on Google. He decided that it was better for him if he didn't want the birth parents coming to find where the baby was. So he changed the law in New York to allow another birth certificate to be created to falsify the name and the parents. So that cut off the tie. That's where that came from. He was acting in his own interests. And that law, everyone loved. So it went all through the States and turned up in Australia. And only now are they talking about integrated birth certificates in New South Wales, which is a document that says here is your adoptive legal status, and as an adoptee, here is where you came from in your original status. But that wouldn't have helped me because that was wrong anyway, right? The other tie beyond the feeble-mindedness, the idea of best interest of the child, that was written into law. And I thought, well, what are the best interests of the child legally? So I went backwards in time to find out how they thought about best interests. And they still don't know what it is. We know.
Yes, we do, Darryl.
Yeah.
We do.
But they still have non-adoptive people writing laws, and it's the stupidity of law, unfortunately, but you have to play in it. You can't just throw down your tools and walk away, or, get a Molotov cocktail and throw it at the government. You can't do that. You've got to do it the right way and use their laws against them if you want a result.
Yeah, Darryl, and I think one of the things you said that really stuck out is, you lift that rock up and all those creepy crawlies come out.
Yeah.
And you can't unsee the truth once you've seen it.
No.
And I think what's going to be so fantastic for people who are listening to all these varied opinions, and I really love the work that you've done. And I think these episodes are going to pair really nicely together because it's going to provide a real history lesson for adopted people and people that are interested in shifting things to look at and really be able to come at it from an educated standpoint. And so I really appreciate the work that you've done. And I'm really looking forward to talking to you again, Darryl. And thank you for sharing your heart and your experience. I know it's not easy to walk through, but I think one thing we talked about as we finish up, we have all been victimized. There is absolutely no doubt. But what I'm aiming to do, and I believe you are, is to switch that into some kind of power for change and some kind of meaning so that we can move out of that victimization into another realm, because it's so disempowering what happened to us. Is that your feeling too?
Learning from the stolen generation, the Aboriginal people over here. One thing that I looked at with them, they have their culture since the beginning, and they have each other and they have their... Now, as a white person, what do I have? The white people that are my ancestors probably wrote these laws. I feel closer to the black community than I do to those people, the aristocracy or whatever they were, or whatever they self-proclaimed experts of their own status. I think that one thing I learned from the stolen generation is that they stick together and they forgive. They do forgive, and I haven't really learnt that yet. I forgave my mother, haven't forgiven the government. Stolen generation are starting to see some redress. They're starting to get some compensation for what they've been through. We are not far away from that. The only difference is culture. The people that were, sexually abused in institutions in Australia, they've had some redress. There's a compensation scheme for them. I haven't heard yet of any compensation for an adoptee for being stolen from its own family. Maybe it'll come. Maybe it's after I've got my own gravestone. But, I've always been one to speak out and, come what may. So, I think the more truth gets out there, some people never want to hear this story, right? This is too hard. People still foster adoption as the right thing to do. You're providing a human service. Look at the latest Women's Weekly and you'll see the latest celebrity that's adopted, or she's put a book out. I think there was one recently that put a book out on it. And the rights of the adoptee as written by an adoptive mother. Interesting. I think you've got to tell the truth. And for those of people that don't want to listen, that's fine, okay? But as adoptees, we have to have a voice to government, and we have been singled out and separated for a long time. They separate us. They change our history. They give us new names. When we go to court, they hide the court case. They don't publish it. It's organised secrecy to keep us quiet. Let's put this on YouTube. No problem.
Yes, Darryl. We're gonna get noisy. We're gonna cause a ruckus.
Why not?
I think it's already started. Thank you so much, kind sir. This has been a great interview with you, and I'm looking very forward to the next one.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Heidi.
Thank you, Darryl.
Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoyed our first interview with adoptee Darryl Nelson. Stay tuned for part 2 up next.